So I've been getting a lot of questions about gearing, and gearing is the most important thing to get strong in this game. So I want to go over what things to pay attention to inside the gear piece. For example, what is item power? What substats can you potentially roll, and which ones to look out for more so than others? Because although there is a lot of min-maxing you can do, if you just do the kind of minimum, which is look for the stats that you kind of want and not min-max every stat, you're going to get a lot stronger. So I've actually found this Reddit post with a spreadsheet attached. So I'll leave a link to this down below for Half Mind Wow Google Doc here that actually has tracked all the different substats on the different pieces of gear. Now, you don't need to dive into this or anything like that because we're going to go over it today. But what you need to know for your gear is that every piece of gear is going to have an item power. This item power is basically the potential of how strong it can be. It actually doesn't tell you much other than that. For example, here, if I have a 778 item power, which is one higher than my ancestral unique, you might think, oh, well, it's better, right? Not necessarily, because all that item power does is potentially tell me how good it can be in terms of its stats, in terms of damage per second, as you see at the top, but it also has substats, and that substats really matter. Okay, the substats can really change whether or not something's good or something's bad. And on top of that, every piece has what we call an inherent stat. The inherent stat is going to be that stat right underneath the damage per second, where you could see the condemnation has plus 30% damage to close enemies, and so does the other dagger, plus 20% damage to close enemies. Every weapon type or armor type generally has some sort of inherent stat that's going to be applicable to every single time you pick up that piece of gear. Now, which one is the most important thing to look out for? Well, it's generally a combination of a few things, and really my best advice for you all is to pay attention to a specific couple of stats on each specific piece of gear. Now, for weapons, we have a ton of different weapons, so I can't go through every single different weapon, but for example, I will pay attention to daggers here because that is oftentimes what I'm using, okay? The daggers have a chance to have that inherent stat of close enemies, or will always have that inherent stat of close enemies, which is very good for the rogue, okay? Always are close if you're playing a melee build, and damage to close enemies is going to be very important. But for example, if I wanted to play a ranged build, I would want to go with swords because damage to close enemies does absolutely nothing for me, right? So daggers are objectively just not that good on a ranged build. The other stats I could potentially get are plus additional core skill damage, critical strike damage. The ones that I personally look for are critical strike damage. That's going to be incredibly important. And in fact, most weapons can actually roll that. Vulnerable damage, that is also another extremely important one. So on your weapons, vulnerable damage is a good one to look out for. And lastly, I generally like the X2 ult stats, depending on where you're at in the game, especially if you're earlier on. Why? Well, because a lot of your Paragon board requires a certain amount of stats. And as I've been messing around with my build a lot, you can see here, I need another 70 or so intelligence in order for us to get plus 15% additional damage to distant enemies. So getting all stats, generally speaking, gives you a lot more value. Going on to your accessories, there's two here that are incredibly important, right? We have the rings and the amulets. For rings, critical strike chance and critical strike damage are the ones that you're going to look for all the time. If it doesn't have critical strike chance or critical strike damage, then it's basically a useless piece. For example, here, if I pull up my rings, you can see that has critical strike chance, and so does the other one. Now, after you get critical strike chance, you do want to look for critical strike damage, but there's also a few other stats that could work depending on your build. Most builds, if not all of them, as far as I've seen, really rely on critical strike chance and critical strike damage, so you're going to want to look for those if you possibly can. Amulet, this is also another very important one because you could actually get plus ranks to all tier 4 and tier 5 spells. And you could also potentially get some ranks to passives. So for my amulet, this is arguably the god amulet for rogue because I get energy cost reduction, which is going to be important for spamming out my skills, but I also get ranks to imbuement skills and ranks to a certain passive that's going to be incredibly important, okay? And on top of that, I get damage reduction to enemies that are poisoned. But the ones that I would really look out for are going to be the ranks to certain skills if you're using those skills. If you're not using those skills, then you could definitely look for damage reduction, additional damage. Cooldown reduction tends to be very, very good for a lot of different builds. And just generally going for damage reduction in the certain, qualifiers. For example, damage reduction for close enemies is going to be very, very important. For armor, now there's a lot of options here. We have boots, pants, helm, chest, gloves, right? I'll go through each one of these because each one of them has very, very drastically different options for you to go for. For boots, generally speaking, I like max evade charge as my inherent stat. So for example, my boots here on the Penitent Greaves gives me additional movement speed whenever I dodge. I personally prefer max evade charges because I oftentimes will be in a scenario where I want to dodge multiple times, and then some other scenarios where I don't really care about dodging. So I prefer max evade charge. After that, I generally look for ranks to tier 3 spells. For my boots here, I have nothing because it's an ancestral unique, but generally I'll go for boots that will give me ranks towards my agility spells, which is going to be the Shadow Step and Dash, which are going to be very, very important. After that, I like the +2 all stats on my boots. That's going to be a very, very important one, once again, for that Paragon value. And then after that, I generally go for movement speed, just because movement speed is going to be very good in general moving around the map. For pants, I generally go for +X to rank spells once again. Specifically tier 4 spells, generally speaking, but depending on what class you are, it really changes. Also, maximum life is going to be extremely good. Damage reduction is going to be very, very good. And any sort of damage reduction that works with your class. For example, I would prefer damage reduction from close enemies and +X to all stats. Keep in mind that the +X to all stats only really matters if you need X to all stats for your Paragon board. After you reach those breakpoints, the value to X to all stats drops drastically because not all stats are good for your class. Oftentimes, +X to a specific stat, the main stat in this case, generally can be a little bit more valuable. Helm, this is also a very important one because it has plus ranks to all spells, or rank 4 spells. For me, that's going to be the imbuement. So for example here, +3 ranks to poison imbuement, which is going to be incredibly important. Also, helms have cooldown reduction, and cooldown reduction is going to be a huge stat to go for as well. So if you're going for helmet, go for cooldown reduction. Chest piece, this one, generally speaking, is going to be for your damage reduction across the board. Specifically, going for plus damage reduction, whatever works for your class. Once again, go for damage reduction for close enemies. Maximum life generally is going to be a combo with temerity, so I generally like that one as well. And then after that, going for things like element damage or +X to damage or plus ranks to tier 3 spells can be very, very good, okay? Gloves, this is arguably the most important piece in the entire game. Why is that? Because it has critical strike chance, critical strike damage, and core spell ranks. So your gloves are going to be the #1 most important piece besides your weapons that are providing you damage, okay? So for example, here on my gloves, I happen to be trying out a penetrating shot build right now. So I am just running some pretty, I guess you'd say, decent gloves. But you can see I have 8.4% critical strike chance, 4 ranks to penetrating shot, and attack speed. So I would love that twisting blades to be critical strike damage or some other thing. The ranks to your core skills is generally going to be the most important thing in your build, as well as critical strike chance. Getting you that critical strike chance is going to inch your way towards as high critical strike chance as you possibly can. And between your gloves, your rings, and then any other slot that could potentially have it, you're going to have a lot of extra critical strike chance, giving you a ton of extra end game damage. Now there's one other piece of gear that I want to talk about. That's uniques. Uniques have inbuilt stats. So you need to remember that if you're going to run a unique, like for example, the Penitent Greaves, then you cannot get the stats that you're looking for on that slot. For example, if we look at the boots, well, boots have movement speed. They have X to all stats. They have ranks to T3 spells. So if I'm going to use Penitent Greaves here, I cannot get ranks to all spells or tier 3 spells because it's not inbuilt to that unique. So if you're running a unique, keep in mind that the effect has to be good enough to not only be better than an effect that you could have used in that slot, because you cannot apply aspects to that slot, but also just have better aspect or stats than what you could have gotten out of that gear piece, right? For example, if I'm gonna run gloves here, if I'm gonna run a unique glove, it better be insane, because you cannot get critical strike chance on that unique glove if it doesn't already have it inbuilt. Hopefully this was helpful, guys. I've seen a lot of people ask like, hey, what's item power mean? Hey, what is all this stuff? Keep in mind, there's all sorts of things to do with upgrading. And to give you a brief little update, there are item breakpoints at certain tiers, and those certain tiers can allow you to reroll the substats, and obviously upgrading your pieces are going to upgrade the substats. So I might have a full video breaking down the upgrade tiers, because that is a confusing topic in of itself. But I know a lot of casual players that are just diving into the game, trying out the game, and they don't quite understand all this nuanced and specific stuff, because it can get very complicated. And in fact, when I have a spreadsheet, or someone made a spreadsheet here with like pages and pages of information, you already know that this could be very complicated. But hopefully this gives you a little bit baseline. If it did help, let me know by liking the video, sub to the channel, and I'll see you all for the next one.